Hi there everyone, this is Paula Keogh here from Arkivum. Welcome to today's webinar. Thanks so much for attending. Today's subject is about protecting research data through data archiving and safeguarded storage. And we have a key speaker here today, our CTO Matthew Addis, who will be taking you through some of the key points. And we're going to make sure that we've got a recording of this for you. So don't worry about scribbling down notes or needing to take screenshots of it. We'll send you a recording after the webinar. What we will do, because we've got a number of people actually on the webinar today, we will keep you muted. If you have a question though, we'd be very delighted to hear it or see it. So you can either use the raise hand icon, or you can obviously type your question in the box as well. If there are any audio issues or anything, please do let us know as well. Hopefully we've tested that, but we'll just make sure. So any issues, do please give us a shout. You can ask questions as we go through, or obviously we'll have some time at the end to ask questions as well. So again, we'll try and make the space to make the webinar as interactive as we possibly can. So I don't think there are any immediate questions that I can see on the screen. So thank you again for joining. And without further ado, I shall hand you over to Matthew. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Paula. And hello to everyone on the webinar. So this webinar we'll have a sort of talk about how research data can be safely stored and made accessible for long periods of time using data archiving and safeguarded storage techniques. So archiving and storage, they're actually just one part of research data management, but they're an important one, and a foundation upon which to build a strong overall research data management solution, especially when research data needs to be accessible long into the future. So what are we going to cover? Well, this webinar is in three parts. We'll look at the drivers, the motivation, the good practice for storing research data for the long term. We'll take a look at some of the solutions for data archiving and preservation storage, including how that fits into the bigger picture of digital preservation, and with quite a focus on outsourcing and hosted solutions that can be used instead of or as well as in-house options. And then we'll wrap things up by looking at Arkivum's approach, how we meet good storage practice, and we'll provide some examples and case studies of how our clients are using our solution to good effect. And of course, as Paula said, there'll be time for Q&A at the end. Okay, so first up, some context on how data archiving and preservation storage fit into the research data management landscape. So why would you care about keeping research data in the first place? Well, for research data, long-term access and hence safe storage, it's sometimes treated as a compliance issue necessary to meet funding body requirements. And many of the funders mandate that research data that is produced or underpins research that they have funded should be made accessible and usable for the long term. And that's mandated by the major research councils, both in the UK and the US. And it's common practice for funders to require a data management plan, explicitly including long-term curation or preservation of research data. And these data management plans are also increasingly sought by independent funders, for example, the Gates Foundation, as well as from government-supported funding bodies. However, whilst it looks on the surface that keeping research data is kind of a compliance issue and a funding body mandate, the underlying reason, of course, is that the funders want researchers to follow good research practice and to create research outputs that could be trusted, are of good quality and can be reused. And this leads to the idea that making research data available helps ensure that research is repeatable and verifiable, and other people can build upon the research that's done by others. And that all ties in with researchers' own desires to produce reputable research outputs and share them with their peers and wider community. And this sort of leads to this idea of findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable data. And in turn, that helps researchers with their reputation. It can lead to further research projects, more funding, more citations, and more impact. But of course, you can't hope to achieve any of those sort of benefits from long-term access to data if you don't have a way to safely store it securely. So it will be so you have some assurance that it'll be there when you need it in the future. And there are wider benefits as well to keeping research data. So institutions that have a good infrastructure and good support for research data management are more likely to attract and retain good research staff. If they can demonstrate good research at the institutional level, that can make the institution more attractive for students, for example, and that can increase student income. And research data can be part of showcasing the institution and what it's capable of. And there are compliance issues too, GDPR or freedom of access to information, and good data storage and management helps an organization meet those compliance requirements too. So actually there's quite a lot of different drivers for why research data needs to be kept, both for the short term and the long term. But the key point I wanted to make is that there's no single set of requirements and there's no single solution that's going to address all of these drivers. So there's some interesting choices and trade-offs to make. So what sort of data are we talking about? Well, we could talk about different types of data in terms of research disciplines or file types or how that data is used. But from a storage perspective, which is the focus of this webinar, these are the key characteristics to consider. That there are typically large volumes of data that need to be kept for the long term, by which we mean decades, with a high level of data safety. That data does need to be accessed, but it may be relatively infrequent. And certainly over that sort of time period, the total cost of ownership needs to be as low as possible in order to make long-term retention sustainable. And it's that TCO, that total cost of ownership issue, that can be the real killer. So budgets are available for long-term retention access, but they are often very limited, especially after the research grant has finished that funded the generation of the research data in the first place. So we'll look a little bit later on at some of the costs of research data storage as well. As I mentioned, there is no single solution to the problem, and it is a case of making trade-offs and compromises. And this triangle of data safety, cost, and access is something that I'll come back to several times in this webinar. And generally speaking, you can have any two of those things, but not all three at the same time. The safer the data needs to be, then the more copies, for example, that you need to create, and the more measures you need to protect it. And that in turn increases the cost. Especially if that data also needs to be accessed frequently and can't just be squirreled away in a deep archive. And different types of data will fit in different sort of parts of that triangle. So primary data, for example, outputs of scientific instruments or oral histories or genomes, that's typically got high safety requirements and low cost because of the volumes, but it doesn't always need to be accessed frequently. On the other hand, you might have derived data that summarizes the primary data, so visualizations, tables, charts, other sort of data products, and that might have a lower level of data safety requirements, but it needs much faster access. But the volumes can be smaller, which means that storing it on faster access solutions, it can actually still be affordable. So, given that's the problem that we're trying to solve, are there any guidelines or solutions out there that help get started? So tell you sort of what do you need to do? Well, the good news is the answer to that is yes. These are just some of the sources of information on to how to tackle the problem of long-term storage and access to research data. And I'll talk through a couple of these in the next few slides. Many of these guidelines and good practice are really coming from the digital preservation community. And it's quite interesting, I think, that institutions such as universities are becoming much more aware of and informed by and involved in these efforts to define what preservation storage is and what it should look like. And this means that those directly engaged or leading research data management with institutions, for example, research data managers, research librarians, research officers, are using these guidelines and good practice as a way of defining and evaluating what an acceptable long-term storage solution should look like. And it also means that if you're on the IT side of the house, then you'll be increasingly asked how to find or provide a solution that fits with these guidelines and follows the good practice that they define. So what do the guidelines say? Or let me show you some examples. So here's a digital maturity model from the NDSA, National Digital Stewardship Alliance. And the idea is that you start at level 1 and you work your way across. And it starts off simple, and it talks about things like keeping more than one copy of the data and storing copies in different geographic locations. And then at higher levels of sophistication, it talks about things like proactive fixity monitoring and repair. And those are some of the strategies I'll talk about a little bit later in this webinar. But the important thing about the NDSA levels is it provides a progression. It's a place to start, and it's a path for improvement. And it makes it legitimate to do something simple and start at level 1. That's a perfectly acceptable and recognized position. You don't have to go all in at level 4 from the outset. And that really helps organizations really get started with a minimal viable solution to long-term storage, and then have a defined path for improvement. And if you want more information on the risks that are mitigated at each of those levels and the benefits, then there's more detail in the DPC Digital Preservation Handbook. And we're quite happy to circulate the slides from this webinar afterwards. So all the things that I'm going to talk about, you'll have access to the URLs, so you can look all these up later if you want to. The Digital Preservation Capability and Maturity Model goes further. That aligns with OAIS, the Open Archive Information System Standard. I'm not going to go into details. There's a couple of examples here around data integrity and archival storage, which is actually quite similar to the NDSA levels. But again, the point is that it's a defined progression where you can start simple and work your way up to recognize good practice. More recently, an international group of organisations, including MIT, UCSD, National Library New Zealand and others, have brought quite a lot of this work together and defined an extensive set of criteria for what they term preservation storage. And this is really great work, and it provides a really concrete set of criteria with which to define, evaluate and compare different options and solutions for long-term safekeeping and access to data. It covers all the stuff in the NDSA levels, capability maturity model, DPC handbook, and more. But it highlights also the need for transparency in storage solutions. So if you don't have visibility of how a storage solution works or how a storage service is provided, then you don't really know that it's doing what it says on the tin, and you can't really trust it. So it's great to see the preservation storage criteria make transparency an explicit criteria. And then finally, I just wanted to highlight some of the assessment audit frameworks out there. So this is the Core Trust Seal, which is a new name for the Data Seal of Approval. You can go further with ISO 16363, and these are some of the Core Trust Seal's criteria, including integrity and data storage, as you'd expect. But it also makes it explicit that it's important to look at the sustainability of long-term retention and access to data. And just like transparency in the preservation and storage criteria, that's a really important issue. So when you're storing research data for decades or more, sustainability, institutional commitment, and funding are really important things to be confident about. So we've made it to the end of part 1. So to recap very briefly, we've looked at the drivers and motivations for keeping research data, the characteristics that are needed from long-term storage, the fact that there's no one-size-fits-all solution, and there are trade-offs between cost and safety and accessibility. And we've had a look at the guidelines and good practice that's available that says how to identify, evaluate, assess, and measure possible solutions, including key characteristics such as transparency and sustainability, as well as more technical issues such as data replication, fixity checking, security, and so on. So now we get to part 2, which is about solutions. So how do we put that good practice into effect? Well, before looking at it in too much detail, I just wanted to take a step back and sort of put research data storage in context, that it is part of a bigger picture of digital preservation, which is all the activities necessary to ensure continual access to digital materials for as long as necessary. And that involves policies, procedures, practices, people, so organizational issues. It involves funding, so budget and resourcing, and it involves technology, so software, hardware, skills, preservation actions. And preservation storage is just one part of digital preservation. So it's important that when you develop a preservation storage strategy, that it's done as part of a wider digital preservation strategy for research data management. I mean, that's sort of more summarized succinctly by Jeff Rothenberg from the RAND Scientific Corporation, who said digital information lasts forever or 5 years, whichever comes first. And that's important because you have to take active steps to ensure that digital information remains alive. And that's why digital preservation as a strategy is really important for long-term research data storage. It's also important to consider that research data storage is just one part of risk management, and there are a lot of bad things that can happen to research data that prevent it from being accessed in the future. And the risks associated with storage are just some of these overall risks. So it's important to consider preservation storage as part of a wider risk management approach, as well as part of a wider digital preservation strategy. And those two things are, of course, connected. Right. Having said that, let's get back to storage. So this picture shows some of the things that can happen over 20 years of trying to store data. So in this diagram, a change from blue to yellow is when something happens that has to be managed. So adding and replacing media, archive storage systems that need monitoring and maintenance and checks, integrity, verification, dealing with obsolescence and hardware and software, and the sort of 3 to 5 year cycles that often goes on. Moving whole solution stacks or providers, dealing with staff. There's a whole series of things that happen. So long-term storage is a world of continual change and having to manage change and the risks that change introduce. And that takes time and money and expertise. And things will go wrong, and they do go wrong. And some are a result of technology, but some are a result of people not doing things properly. So that chart here shows that human error is a common cause of data loss. So preservation is about people. Technology can help, but only if you understand it, including its weaknesses and how to address those. And when you do pick a storage approach or a strategy or a storage solution, no matter how shiny and great it looks today, sooner than rather than later, there will be problems. So today's showroom storage becomes tomorrow's old storage banger, if you like. So the answer to that, I think, is threefold. So this is a strategy for long-term storage, and it's based on 3 pillars. The first is to create multiple copies of the data and store them in different geographic locations, ideally using different technologies or even different people to look after your copies. And diversity is your friend here. And Arkivum, we do exactly that. We guarantee data integrity and we follow a 3-2-1 rule. So at least 3 copies of the data in 3 separate locations, 2 online and 1 offline. And that offline copy is important. It's a firebreak, and I'll talk more about that a bit later. The second part of the strategy is to migrate the copies of the data regularly. So keep the data moving on to new storage pastures. So if data, for example, is on a storage media such as tape or disk for more than 5 years, then worry, because after that point, there's a good chance that the media might fail, the data could start to be degraded, or there's some storage system failure or obsolescence issue that means it's going to be hard to get to that data when you need it. And as humanity generates more and more data and technical advances are made to store it, then actually obsolescence becomes faster. It happens on a shorter time scale. So storage gets better and cheaper, but it lasts for less time. So managing obsolescence is an inevitability. I mean, sometimes it's tempting to try and bypass that, fight the trend of obsolescence, and look for long-term storage technologies. But that can actually be really expensive. I mean, I don't mean the storage media itself, but the technology needed to write the data, and it can be very slow. So in a world where data volumes are growing, trying to get everything onto magical long-term storage really is difficult. There may be some cases where this sort of idea of eternal storage makes sense, but actually it's just shifting the risk to other places. And you need to ask the question of whether the vendor of these cool storage technologies will actually survive as long as the product that they're offering. And the world of cool storage is littered with vendors who've taken products to market, but then discontinued those products or gone bust. Better, I think, in many cases is go with the flow and make the most of commodity IT storage and actually the opportunities that regular migration brings. And that's not least as the cost of storage and how it falls. So this is a 1980s hard drive. It's not even a new one, it's reconditioned. And in that 35 years since this advert, you can now get 1 million times as much storage for less than 1/10 of the price. And you can buy it in a commodity shop just around the corner. Now, I'm not saying that you should buy storage from PC World or Walmart for those of you in the US. That's not a storage strategy. But what I am saying is that storage servers and storage services built using commodity storage, they will continue to fall in price. And riding that wave of commodity IT uses less space, uses less power, it becomes faster, and it's easier to access data. So it's a bit like replacing that old broken down car with a sort of a new, clean, green, super fast model and being able to do that on a regular basis. So a quick recap. The strategy I'm proposing, and this follows the good practice that I talked about earlier, is to make multiple copies of the data, keep them in different locations, and use diversity to spread the risk of failure. So that's not having all your eggs in one basket. And then you actively manage the copies by migrating to new storage or formats to address obsolescence, and by regularly checking and repairing any loss of data integrity. And if you've got multiple copies of the data, and if there's problems with any one of them, then you can use the other copies to recover from. So there is no excuse really for losing digital data, and it's not rocket science. Although ironically, standards such as OAS did originate from NASA because their rocket scientists did lose data, the moon landings, but it does require skills and expertise and the right policies and procedures and the right infrastructure. It's perfectly possible to do that yourself. There's a large number of tools that are available, products and services too for safe storage. This is just a few of them. So it ranges from self-repairing file systems to file replication, checksumming, fixity checking, hierarchical storage management, data lifecycle management, and more. There's open source and commercial products and services, and it's possible to mix and match them. And storage can be on-premise, hosted, or provided by a third party. So there's lots of choices, but in the end, it comes back to this trade-off between cost and safety and ease of access. So it's back to this triangle, and there's no solution that gives the right balance. And given the diversity of research data types and the different drivers for keeping it, it's likely that you may need more than one solution. And building and running solutions also cost money. So I said I'd talk a bit about total cost of ownership, and there's lots of factors to consider, and estimating long-term TCO is actually quite hard. There's lots of moving parts. I could do a whole talk on cost modeling, but in fact there's a whole European project to do just that. But I think I just provide a couple of sort of examples that actually you can go and look at what service providers are offering, whether it's built in on in-house solutions like STSC or public cloud, and look at how their storage has changed in price over time. And that gives you an idea about the long-term total cost of ownership of storage solutions. And then comes the question of whether you want to do preservation storage in-house or whether you want to outsource it. And there's many questions to help resolve that question. So is preservation storage really your core business, or are you better off using your resources in other ways? And actually, are you better off outsourcing, because there are specialists out there with infrastructure and skills and people who can do potentially a better job than would be possible for you to achieve in-house. And cloud, of course, is an obvious thing to consider when outsourcing storage. The key thing here is to recognize that cloud is just computers that are running somewhere else. Those computers might have software on them and be running as part of a service, but in the end, it's just someone else's servers that you're using. So cloud isn't a magic solution, and all those storage criteria and guidelines and good practice still apply. It's just that the balance between the criteria can change. So there may be more emphasis when you're looking at cloud storage on things like what's the service level agreement, what's the exit strategy, what are the conditions of use. And I'll cover that a bit more later. And no surprise, that same triangle of trade-offs also applies between safety and cost and access. And I've pulled up some numbers from Amazon here just to illustrate this. So Amazon S3 is geo-replicated, it's fast access storage, so it's both quick to get to your data and it gives you a good level of data safety, but it's not cheap. You can sacrifice speed and frequency of access to the data, and that drops the cost. And you can also reduce the level of data safety, and that further reduces the cost. You don't have to sacrifice everything at one time. So AWS Glacier provides, for example, low-cost durable storage, but you wait a lot longer if you need to access the data. And when you do need to access the data, that can actually incur significant costs because of data egress charges, as this example from Oracle shows. So there really are sort of trade-offs that you still need to make. The other thing I'd say about cloud storage is you often see talk about durability. So there's sort of 11 nines, for example, on how safe data is. What does that really mean? Well, it's just a statement about the probability that a provider won't lose your data. It's a statement on the chance of your data surviving when you store it. And I could do a whole talk on data durability and metrics. But the two things I will say is that durability statements are just estimates. They're statistical models. Then it's not like cloud providers have stored data for decades to really have evidence. It's they're making estimates and projections into the future. And these sort of durability things, you don't see them as part of the SLA or the contract, with the exception of Arkivum, as I'll talk about later. So the example I've got here is, well, actually, if you draw the analogy between data durability and driving a car, if I get in my car and I drive on in the UK, then I've got a 99.99% chance of making my journey successfully without breaking down. But people make 600 trips each in the UK, and there are actually 20,000 breakdowns on the roads each day. So whilst it's very rare for an individual person to experience a breakdown, actually it happens quite often for the population as a whole. And large-scale data storage in cloud providers is just the same. And it also means that statistics can be interpreted or misinterpreted in various ways. Just because there are 11 nines sort of durability doesn't mean that you can put data in an object and it will last in the cloud for 1 million years. And it doesn't mean that you can do crazy things like take millions of small data objects and put them into one big data object and expect it to be 1 million times safer. It just doesn't apply. It doesn't make sense. So it's important to understand what's on the inside of cloud solutions. So it's back to how many copies of the data do they make? How independent are they? What technologies do they use? What checks do they make? How do they deal with migrations and obsolescence? So it's back to transparency. And because it's someone else's solution, having an exit plan is important. So be able to mitigate against a problem at a cloud provider. Maybe they go out of business. Maybe they don't provide the service you want. Maybe you want to just migrate back in-house. So exit plans are important, and there are plenty of examples of when exit plans have needed to be put into effect when using cloud solutions. There are also some useful resources on what to consider in an exit plan. So this is the Cloud Standards Customer Council, and their practical advice. So there's some, in addition to preservation storage criteria, there are some extra guidelines if you are going to consider cloud storage or hosted solutions. And it's covered in things like the Core Trust Seal, so things like disaster recovery and business continuity. It's part of ISO 16363 in terms of escrow and succession planning and budgeting for all those things, including exit. So it's just an important thing to include when considering cloud storage instead of or in addition to in-house solutions. And these are just some of the things that an exit plan should include. So no lock-in to the vendor, part of the contract, and something that you can test and verify actually works in practice, rather than just being something that's claimed by the vendor. And if you are going to use cloud storage, the question becomes of how you get your data in and out. And that's often done through cloud gateways, or on-ramps as they're called. And cloud storage often comes in the form of object storage, and that's not quite the same as file storage that we tend to use for local applications and services. And gateways and on-ramps bridge that gap. And that's great because it can mean someone else's cloud storage can look just like a network drive from your point of view, which makes it easy to use. But it does mean that other things are going on behind the scenes. So things like compression and encryption and deduplication and mapping of files to objects and so on. And that's important because it helps keep things like the cost down or deal with security issues. But it does mean that the data that's in the cloud isn't physically identical to the data as you might see it locally. So you need to understand what those transformations and data manipulations are and the risks that might be associated with them. I mean, there's nothing wrong with this approach. It's just another thing to consider when thinking about cloud storage. So to round up, cloud as part of a preservation storage strategy, these are the key things to consider, I think. This sort of idea of diversity and multiple copies, use more than one cloud provider, and look carefully at how you get data in and out of those cloud providers, and then protect yourself. Make sure there's an exit plan that you can test so you can migrate back in-house or to another provider, or create a burn line copy. So that's something that is completely independent of the cloud provider that you're using. And it could be an in-house copy that you have, it could be another cloud copy, it could be on site. And that means if everything goes wrong, then you've got something to fall back on and to recover from. And that's an important part of disaster recovery. So now we've got to the end of part 2. So what I've hopefully provided is some insights into how to achieve safe storage of research data in practice, and the key elements. So independent, geo-separated copies of data, active management and fixity checking, understanding and planning for migrations, the need for exit plans, and tested sort of exports or migrations. Been quite critical in your assessment of whether you should or can or need to do long-term storage in-house, or whether you would be better off outsourcing, including the need or including using the cloud. And the fact that you need to look at the long-term costs as part of the sustainability, and the fact that those costs aren't always easy to calculate in the full. So hopefully that's been quite informative so far. What I wanted to do in the last bit of the webinar before I hand over to Paula is talk a little bit about how we put that into practice at Arkivum. So this is Arkivum's approach, and then I'll hand over to Paula for a case study. So the first thing to say is that Arkivum provides solutions and services for long-term data management. So we go far beyond safe storage. We actually deliver a wide range of capabilities to ensure that data can be easily safeguarded, preserved, accessed, value can be maximized, and compliance can be met. So this talk isn't about our solutions. I just wanted to make you aware of the breadth of what we do before we look at this data safeguarding specific part. And we provide our solution as a fully managed service, and that includes many aspects of data safeguarding that follow all the good practice and practical approach that I've talked about. So basically we do a lot of that heavy lifting, so our customers don't have to worry about doing it themselves. And our solution includes safeguarded storage, and it can be deployed in a range of ways, both on-premise or in private cloud or using third-party providers. And it fulfills the archival storage function of the OIS model. So I think it's very important to align with these sort of standards. And the way it works in detail is that we, as you'd expect, take incoming data and we geo-replicate it to create multiple independent copies in different geographic locations. And these could be in our UK data centers or at customer sites or at colo providers. Data is typically encrypted first using keys that the customer provides and owns. So for example, in our UK hosted solution, we create and store 2 copies of the data in our UK data centers using disk and tape, and then a third offline copy that goes to an independent third party for escrow. And all the copies are verified for data integrity using checksums. And when all 3 copies are created and confirmed as being safely stored, then we offer a data integrity guarantee as part of the contract that there's 0 data loss. And that's backed by insurance. And that really differs from other cloud storage providers. And then at that point onwards, as part of our fully managed service, that's where we take care of all the necessary fixity checks, media migrations, hardware and software updates, and basically everything necessary to protect the data and ensure it remains accessible. And we use checksums throughout, both to confirm the correct receipt of data into our solution and to confirm that every copy we make in the different locations is complete and correct. And when we deliver data back out, and whenever the customer needs it, is also integrity checked. So we have this sort of end-to-end chain of custody where we can demonstrate and our customers know that the integrity and authenticity of their content is being maintained. And we store one of the copies of the data with a third party in escrow, and that means if we fail to deliver the service that we promise, or our customers want to exit, then they can do so without any lock-in to Arkivum in any way. So that's a robust and built-in exit strategy. And we use open standards and open specifications and open source, especially as part of that exit strategy. And that really means that our customers can recover their original data from escrow without the need for any proprietary software or lock into Arkivum in any way. There's of course a lot more detail that I could go into, But that wasn't really the objective of our webinar to talk about Arkivum's specific solution. It was to talk about generally what's good preservation practice for storing research data for the long term, and what are the guidelines and what approaches you can take. And that's exactly what we follow at Arkivum in our solution. I've talked far too much, I suspect. I probably need to pause for breath a bit, think about whether there's any questions, and also hand back to Paula so she can talk about the case study.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. That's brilliant. You do have a question. I've very kindly sent it to you so you can have a quick look at it while I'm chatting away about the case study. So yeah, I've given you a bit of homework.
Brilliant.
Yeah, we thought it would be really valuable to give you a bit of a real world example, because that's probably the question that I would be asking if I were you. Because what's really great is to hear about the best practice and the best way of doing things, but how are universities in particular implementing these sorts of things? You know, to what extent is this actually the reality out there in the big web world? So we, I mean, Arkivum has you know, close to 100 different academic customers, but one of the really interesting ones is, as you can see here, the University of Nottingham. Now, they this year actually embarked on a whole new strategy, a sort of a they had understood, like many of you on this call, that from a central IT sort of point of view, there really wasn't a platform, a place, a strategy for being able to put all of the RDM data together and do clever, interesting, and compliant things with it. So as you can see here, part of the problem that Nottingham was solving was, as we've talked about already, the ever-increasing amount of high quality but also high volume of research data being churned out by all of the researchers at the institution. The main issue from Nottingham's point of view was that there wasn't one single place to go for it. There were lots of places, as Matthew says. You know, you can buy external hard drives from the high street, and that's you know, sometimes some examples of what researchers could do. So there's got to be a better strategy than that. The interesting thing is as well that you don't necessarily, as central IT, as the Research Data Management Office, as the library, as whomever, you don't necessarily know where the data is or what the data is. So again, build it and they will come kind of practice really helps to uncover some of these potentially, you know, invaluable pieces of research. With unknown data comes unknown cost. So it's very, very tricky to predict the trajectory of the amount of storage that you're going to need, and therefore the cost of that storage, if you don't know how much you're going to have. It's always a guesstimate, but to be able to be more aware of what you have is certainly the first step on that road. So that's exactly one of the reasons that Nottingham wanted to reimagine their whole research strategy. We've mentioned compliance. This obviously applies to making sure that the research councils, the funding, grant provision, all of that regulation and legislation, as it says there, has been adhered to. And part of the aim of the overall strategy, as you can see there, is to make sure that the research is able to be shared where appropriate, that you can actually pull together some interdisciplinary research, which may not have otherwise been possible. Obviously, the output of the research should be of higher and higher quality, and it puts University of Nottingham even more on the map. You know, if you can say that you're at the forefront of this level of research, then that's got to be a good thing. So moving on then to the solution. Matthew, can I ask you to move the slide on? Amazing, thank you. What they wanted from Arkivum was a central platform for all researchers. And what we mean by this is a central place to put things, a central place to find things. So you've got the whole sort of life cycle management, as Matthew alluded to here, from creation to ingest to description, the metadata, what is it, where is it, how big is it, what's it about, all the way through to access, reuse, and then management at the end of its life, if that's appropriate. So what University of Nottingham did was add an initial capital investment to kickstart this project. It meant that they had a totally predictable data management cost. It did obviously reduce their costs. That's a really key thing. And one of the things that they're doing now as part of this sort of new phase of work is that they're trying to build in sustainable funding models to make sure that actually we don't come across this problem of not having the investment for the research data 25 years after it was written. So that's a really key part of what Nottingham's doing, is making sure that those funding models are totally sustainable. The other thing, as you can see here, is that it does make sure that they're complying with all of the right legislation, and that it's protected for the correct amount of time. As we've seen, it's not easy to keep data for decades, and so that if they're able to essentially outsource the management of that to an expert provider like Arkivum, then they know that they're complying from that point of view as well. We're helping with the university's reputation for all of the reasons that we saw on the aims on the first slide, and hopefully the whole point of this, as we said at the beginning, was to make scientific discovery easier, to make sure that we're progressing human knowledge in all of its areas, and it's really key to the research strategy. And on the next slide, if we just move on, then Alison Clark, who's the director of the whole digital research sort of body at the University of Nottingham, she runs the whole team, and this is sort of why it was established. It's about trying to make those cognitive links, those physical links sometimes between departments, between research disciplines, between individual different teams, to make sure that there's a cohesive and coherent approach to research. And the absolute bedrock of that is archival storage. And actually, what Nottingham have done is that they started small. They did an initial phase 1 approach, which was for a small scale sort of proof of concept, I suppose, which lasted just under a year. And then, as I say, this year they've moved on to provisioning just over 1 petabyte of data archival storage space with Arkivum, to be able to make sure that all of that predicted research output is managed, compliant, and in the one place. So we wanted to give you a real world example. They're interesting and unique, not least because a petabyte of data is a large commitment, and that's a really great thing to do. But it is definitely worth making sure that people understand that we also, as I say, have a number of other customers that need to start small and grow. That's a very, very valid approach, and indeed that's exactly what University of Nottingham did. So yeah, really very interesting project to be involved in. So we wanted to share some of the key information with the people on the webinar today. We do have a short video that we'll share with the recording of this webinar as well. It's just about the University of Nottingham, specifically about their digital research efforts and the value of that. So just giving you some of the background on why they're doing that. If that helps with some of your internal discussions and business case arguments, then we'd be delighted to point you to that. So you'll get that as part of the sort of resource pack as a result of this session as well. Thanks, Matthew. I'll hand back to you for questions, because we've definitely got one which hopefully you've now seen.
Yes, thank you. I have seen that question. So the question is, does Arkivum use deduplication technology, and does that provide any benefit really for research data? I mean, that's an interesting question, and by deduplication, that covers several things. It covers compression. So do you have files or data files that can be made smaller by compressing them? It covers, do you have multiple copies of the same thing. So duplicated content and deduplication can spot those copies and reduce that duplication. And deduplication can mean looking inside files and spotting that the same content is within a set of files. Even though each individual file is different, it may share some similar content, and that can be used for deduplication. And a typical example of that is things like emails, where emails may have attachments to them. So you might have a Word document attached to multiple emails within an organization. So each individual email is slightly different, but it's got the same attachment, and there's potential for deduplication. So if we look at some of those things, compression for research data, typically data that's of any size, someone's already done work to work out a way of compressing it already. So whether it's audio-visual content or images or genome data or big data sets from scientific instruments, there is typically a compression scheme already in existence and widely used for those data types. So it's very difficult to get any additional compression of that data when you put it into a storage solution. So that I think there's limited benefit from using compression as part of deduplication. Equally for research data, especially for the larger data types, so sort of primary data, it's not that common to have lots of copies of the same thing. So if you've got genomics data, yes, you might have a lot of genomes, but each individual genome, you only hold one copy of it because the data volumes are large. Likewise for seismic survey data in oil and gas, or even video recordings as part of audio oral histories, you typically have one copy of that file in existence. So it's not common to see a lot of duplication when that content is put into an archive, and hence deduplication strategies don't offer necessarily a lot of benefit. So yes, Arkivum does now use deduplication. I'm not convinced that it does offer substantial benefits for research data, in particular primary research data, but it does have its use cases. So for example, we're using it internally, especially for corporate data. So emails and documents and presentations and other forms of records where organizations do often have a lot of copies of that stuff. And they don't manage it particularly well internally. So when they do transfer it to an archive, the ability to deduplicate it on the way in and only store one canonical version of it, which then of course gets replicated for data safety reasons, but just deduplicating it, that for corporate content can make a lot of sense. But for research data, I'm not convinced.
Okay, great stuff. I'll leave the question panel open in case there are anyone else. Oh, thank you, Adam. Yes, he says great, thanks. In case there's anybody else who would like to ask a question. Obviously, as you know, we'll be sending you a copy of the slides as part of the video and the link to the other video that I mentioned as well. And obviously you can see that mine and Matthew's contact details are there as well if you'd like to drop us a line about anything that sort of preying on your mind and you'd like a little bit of guidance on. We're very happy to have that discussion. I don't think there are any other questions. I'll just wait for people to stop furiously typing, just in case someone's saying, hang on. But I think we're at our time, so that's perfect. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much for your time and attention today. Hope it was useful. As I say, we'll be getting in touch with the recording, and hopefully we will see or speak to you again very soon. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye for now.
Yes, and thank you very much from me as well.